When you think about America's Gilded Age, that time of incredible industrial growth right after the Civil War, it's easy to picture factories and railroads. But a huge movement of people was happening that didn't just build an industrial powerhouse, it completely reshaped the nation itself. So today, we're going to explore how those journeys created the America we know.
It's so easy to get caught up in the big names of the era, right? The Carnegies, the Rockefellers. But the real story, the one that actually changed the country's DNA, is about the millions of ordinary people whose journeys, whose labor, and whose incredible resilience really did build a new America from the ground up. So this whole transformation was really driven by two massive parallel movements happening at the exact same time. You had people arriving from across the oceans, and you had people moving within the country's own borders.
Yeah.
The whole era was defined by these two huge currents. On one hand, you've got international immigration, which brought millions of people from Europe and Asia. And on the other hand, you have internal migration. And the most critical part of that was the exodus of African Americans from the South. When you put those two together, they wove this new kind of society that was way more diverse, but also, almost overnight, way more divided.
So what on earth could drive such a massive upheaval? Well, the answer really lies in this set of incredibly powerful forces, what historians call the push factors that drove people away from their homes and the pull factors that drew them toward a new life in America.
And when you look closely, the reasons these two groups were on the move were just worlds apart. For international immigrants, the main pull was economic. It was the promise of a steady job. But for the exodusters, the African Americans migrating out of the South, the pull was something so much more fundamental. It was about safety, about freedom. And the push factors? Just as different. Immigrants were fleeing poverty, sure, but Black Americans were fleeing the systemic terror of Jim Crow, the laws and social codes that brutally enforced racial segregation.
Let's just zoom in on Europe for a second. The pressure to leave was just immense. I mean, it was this combination of widespread poverty, cities that were impossibly overcrowded, and these really rigid class systems where you just had no hope of moving up. But for a lot of people, it was even worse. Jewish immigrants, for example, were fleeing organized, state-sponsored violence, these horrific pogroms in the Russian Empire. For them, America wasn't just an opportunity, it was a refuge. It was survival.
And for African Americans, especially after Reconstruction failed and those federal protections were pulled out, moving wasn't about finding a better job. It was truly an act of survival. The South had become a place of profound, life-threatening injustice, and for many, leaving was the only option they had left.
Okay, so these powerful forces are pushing and pulling people across oceans and state lines. But who exactly were they, and where did they all go? Because this movement didn't just add to the population, it completely redrew the demographic map of the United States.
There was this really big shift in who was arriving. Before the Gilded Age, most immigrants were from Northern and Western Europe, think Irish, Germans. But this period saw a massive surge of what we call new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, people from Italy, Greece, Poland, and Russia. At the same time, the West Coast was being shaped by ongoing immigration from China and Japan.
And the scale of that internal migration? It's just staggering. An estimated 40,000 African-American exodusters made that incredibly difficult journey west to escape the South. This wasn't some small trend. This was a massive, collective act of will, just born out of desperation and a whole lot of hope.
And where they ended up was just as distinct as why they left. Overwhelmingly, something like 70% of European and Asian immigrants settled in the big industrial cities: New York, Chicago, San Francisco. The exodusters, though, they carved a totally different path westward, heading for places like Kansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. Two different streams reshaping two different parts of the country.
So this convergence, especially in the cities, had a revolutionary impact. It didn't just make cities bigger, it completely remade them. It created a new kind of urban landscape, one that was, for the first time in American history, deeply segregated.
So how did this happen? Well, it all started with new technology, things like streetcars. This actually allowed the middle and upper classes to move out to quieter, greener areas, what we'd now call the first suburbs. As they left, the central urban core got left behind. It became the domain of the working class, the poor, and the millions of newly arrived immigrants and migrants who'd poured in to take their place.
And life in these city cores, it was incredibly grim. We are talking about severely overcrowded tenement buildings with awful ventilation and little to no clean water. These conditions were basically a perfect breeding ground for diseases like cholera and tuberculosis, and it led to these devastating public health crises.
The human cost of this rapid unplanned growth was just staggering.
But here's the thing. People are not just victims of their circumstances. They didn't just endure this hardship, they responded. And that's the other absolutely crucial part of this story, how they built these resilient, vibrant communities in the face of it all, basically creating worlds within worlds.
The key to this resilience was the ethnic enclave. Now, these neighborhoods were so much more than just a place to live. In the Gilded Age, they were essential survival mechanisms. They provided this critical buffer against a new country that was often bewildering and, frankly, hostile.
So let's look at how they actually worked. In New York's Little Italy, you had churches and Italian-language newspapers that became community anchors. In Chicago's Polish downtown, fraternal organizations provided everything from insurance to political clubs. And in San Francisco's Chinatown, community banks and groceries were absolute lifelines, especially when you consider the intense discrimination they faced. These were real, practical support networks.
But it wasn't always about separation. In Ybor City, Florida, something really interesting happened. There, Cuban, Spanish, and Italian cigar workers all lived and worked right alongside each other. And this closeness forged this unique blended culture. And, fascinatingly, it made this city a hotbed for labor organizing. They found a common cause that crossed ethnic lines.
So when you step back, you see that the Gilded Age didn't just build factories, it really did build a new kind of American city. It was segregated and it was full of incredible hardship, absolutely. But it was also home to these vibrant, self-sustaining communities forged right in the heart of all that struggle.
And all of this leaves us with a really critical question to chew on. As the wealthy moved out to the suburbs, this physical and social distance grew between them and the city centers. So how did that separation, that out-of-sight, out-of-mind reality, affect the political will to actually do something about the poverty and disease that the communities left behind were facing every single day?